So the next step is to wire up our keys from the keyboard and stops to work with our Hauptwerk encoder. But before we wire them up, we need to know how to do it. In other words, which keys go to which pins and all that sort of thing. Now there's two ways that we can do this. You could either just follow a diagram that says the C key of the first octave plugs into here and so on and so forth, and just run wires for each one. But that's fraught with danger, because if you make a mistake you're probably not going to realise until at the end when it doesn't work, and by that time, if you've made more than one mistake, it's going to be a bit of a nightmare to try and sort out. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to explain just briefly really how the whole system is supposed to work. And if you can bear with us through this, it's not too technical, it's quite simple really. If you can just go through this with us, then at the end of it, it should be fairly obvious exactly how everything wires up. So that's the next thing that we're going to do. Okay, so like pretty much everything else these days, our encoder is just a little baby computer. And what it does is that it scans the keyboard octave by octave, key by key, over and over again, so that it knows which keys are pressed down and when you press them down and when you release them. So what we need to do first of all is to split our keyboard into octaves. So you'll remember that when we looked at the wiring earlier on, there's one long common bus that runs along every key, one side of every key along the keyboard. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut that so that it's in octaves. So we're going to end up with 5 common lines, one for each octave. So we're going to cut that long common bus into 5 pieces, which we're then going to connect to the octave pins or connections on our encoder. And starting at the left hand end of the keyboard, we're going to call them octave numbers 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. And then the notes, which are the individual little wires, one from each key, we're going to connect all the C's together, all the C sharps together, all the D's together, and so on. So at the end of the operation we will end up with 12 wires, one for all the C's, one for all the C sharps and so on, and one set of 5 wires, one for each octave. And those are what's going to connect to our encoder. Now, the way the encoder works is that it sends out a signal to one of the octave common lines, and then it measures each note line coming back. So if you've pressed down a C and an E, for example, in that octave, then the C line and the E line will be live and all the other lines won't be. And that's because the computer or the encoder has put out a signal onto the common line for the whole octave, and when you press down the C key and the E key, remembering they're just switches, those are connected then to that common line, so they become live as well. So when the computer measures the signal on those lines, it can see that the C key and the E key are pressed down because they're live, and all of the other lines are not live because the keys are not pressed down. It does this for every octave, one after the other. So for the first octave on the keyboard, the far left hand octave, it sets that common bus a logic high or plus volts or turns on or whatever you want to call it. They all mean the same thing. Basically that bus is switched live. And then it measures or listens to or looks at the 12 note lines of the octave, and then it switches that common line off for octave number 1, it switches the common line on for octave number 2, listens to all of the note lines again, and so on, all through all of the octaves on all of the keyboards, and it just goes round and round, and that's what it spends its life doing. Now, we mentioned earlier that we need diodes attached to each key. Now, the reason for this is that if you imagine that you're playing octaves, so you're playing, for example, a C in octave number 1 and a C in octave number 2 at the same time, the C line is connected to the common bus in octave number 1, which is switched on. But if you're pressing the same C key in octave number 2, that C line is also connected to the common octave bus on octave number 2, which is turned off, and that's a bit of a problem. So what the diodes do is that they allow electricity to flow one way only. So if you look at the diagram here, you can see that in octave 1 the bus is live, the C key is pressed, and therefore the power flows through the diode and along the C line. But when it gets to octave number 2, which is turned off, albeit that the key is pressed as well, it can't flow backwards through that diode. Because if it could, then obviously you'd have a short circuit between the bus that's turned on at 5 volts and the bus that's turned off at 0 volts, and the whole thing would go horribly wrong. So that's why we need a diode on every key. So when we finish wiring up our keyboards, we will have one wire for every octave. Those are our common octave buses, lines, call them what you will, and we will have 12 wires, one for each note from the keys. So just to reiterate, all of the C keys will be connected together, so the C of octave 1 will connect to the C of octave 2, to the C of octave 3, and so on. The C sharps from octave 1 connects to octave 2, and so on and so on. And that goes for all 12 of the notes. So we'll have 12 note wires or key wires coming out of the keyboard, and we will have one wire for every octave. And then those wires will connect to our encoder, and we'll look at how and where we connect those later on.